Further questions? Representative Saunders, for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative McKeel, for your work on this. I'd like to direct my question to Representative Fresen to talk or ask about something in the education budget. Representative Fresen, I'd like to follow up on the conversations around Bright Futures. I see that we are taking out $27.6 million because there is less enrollment, because of caps that we placed, increased caps we placed on eligibility. I'm wondering if there was discussion or if you've considered expanding those caps rather than taking, sort of leaving things where we are and denying students access to that, instead using those funds keeping those funds in Bright Futures, but instead raising the caps of eligibility and giving more people access. Have you considered that?
Representative Fresen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify, Representative Saunders, the reduction in total Bright Futures money is not as a result of a cap. We did not cap the number of enrollees. All that happened a few years ago, like it happens with just about everything. Matter of fact, the ACTs themselves and GPAs themselves are constantly recalibrated to actually reflect, what standards should or should not be. From the origin of Bright Futures, there was always said we're going to go and we're going to try to recruit and maintain our best and brightest. And what are the standards for best and brightest? And it was determined to be a certain ACT score, SAT score, and a certain GPA. It's been recalibrated a couple times since to actually adjust to the reality of instruction and what standards are at our high schools nationally and in Florida. 2 years ago, we recalibrated what that standard would be for a Bright Future or excellence, and because of that new standard, there are less students that would qualify, but it's not because of a cap, it's because of who would qualify. So there's nothing artificial as far as a cap. Total number per student funding for Bright Futures is still the same. The reduction is as a result of less enrollees being qualified for Bright Futures.
For follow-up.
Thank you for that clarification. And so let me rephrase. It's clear to me that the standards were raised and it is now harder to get access to the Bright Future Scholarship. And so we have taken money and moved it into another part of the budget, about $27 million today, because the standards were raised and less students have access. Have you considered, rather than moving those funds away, keeping them where they are and suggesting to this body that we release the pressure on those standards so that more students have access to the Bright Future Scholarship and the opportunities that come from post-secondary education?
Representative Fresen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I think it's important to note that the 27.6 that is a reduction directly to Bright Futures wasn't taken and put into a transportation bill or somewhere else. It's still in higher ed. It was just moved over to other increases we made throughout the higher ed system. Second point, as far as to whether or not we've considered that, there was lengthy debate and discussion 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whenever it was that we recalibrated what the standards would be for Bright Futures as to why that was happening. And it was evident, two things were evident. One, that to actually manifest the intent of Bright Futures, which is to provide incentives for our best and brightest to make sure that they don't leave the state of Florida, the standards were actually too low. And secondly, that in order to reflect what was actually happening with the ACT changes, SAT changes, and GPAs, that it had to more properly reflect what those standards were. So that hasn't been considered, certainly not in a budget discussion, and my budget, the education budget rather, simply reflects the actual enrollment or the actual qualified student body that will qualify for Bright Futures.
For a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I went to college on the Bright Future Scholarship. I wouldn't be the person I am today. I probably wouldn't be standing here if I didn't have access to the opportunities that came from it, so you can understand why I would be passionate about it. Representative Fresen, there was a study that came out from the University of South Florida that looked at data and these new standards and who might be denied access to Bright Futures as a result of this increase in standards. They looked at which students would not get access to the $27 million that aren't being put into Bright Futures now. I believe it was up to 60%. There could be 60% of Hispanic students who had access to Bright Futures who would not have access to it now. My question is, in light of that study, would you consider a change to this budget and a suggestion to this body that we bring those standards back to the pre-2011 levels so that students could have access to the Bright Future Scholarship?
Representative Fresen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Saunders, the only reason why I wouldn't and why we didn't in the exercise that we had in this budget exercise and in our Bright Futures is because the discussion that you're having, which might be a legitimate one, and certainly those statistics could be, you're talking about a scholarship program that was never intended to be either a financial aid program or a program to direct itself towards minority participation in college. Simply put, the Bright Futures, when it was created legislatively, the intent always was to make sure, blind of who it is that's qualifying, that the best and brightest students in the state of Florida would not flee Florida to go to another institution. In order to do that, we had to make sure that A, was sustainable financially, and B, that we set a standard for what that best and brightest was, who are the students most likely to be poached, for lack of a better term, to go to an out-of-state school, and can we create an incentive for that student, regardless of race, regardless of income level, if they're the best and brightest in their high school, to be retained in the state of Florida with an incentive. That's the origin of the Bright Futures. To have a discussion about needs-based or ethnic-based financial aid is a different discussion, but as far as Bright Futures is concerned, all we did was calibrate what a standard for high achievement was in high school, reflect that, and then those that qualify are the ones that are funded in this budget.
Representative Saunders for a follow-up.
Thank you, and thank you for that response. I would just like to ask a question about the tuition hikes. I know at the beginning of the session, our leaders from our state universities got together and they made a request to the legislature that we bring back the $300 million that was taken last year from the trust funds, and that an additional, I believe it was $118 million, be placed back in so that they would not have to raise tuition. Tuition is a really important issue in my district. About 40% of my constituents are students, and so my question is, how did we get from that conversation at the beginning of session to a 6% tuition increase in this budget?
Representative Fresen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say, Representative Saunders, that the reason why the discussion of the $118 million was taking place pre-session, that was just to answer a question asked of the university presidents, that in lieu of tuition rate increases, what would be the amount needed to not raise tuition, which is $118 million. But they never, as a group or as an organization, not in my recollection anyway, have they been completely opposed to the concept of tuition increases, particularly as small as the ones that we have here. But I think the more important point to note is that the 6% increase that we're talking about in this budget is still a smaller share of the total funding for a university than there was last year. So even though there's a 6% increase, it still only actually accounts for 45% of the total cost of instruction, which is actually lower as a proportion than it was last year for universities.
Further questions? Further questions?